Warning, this video on a now 10-year-old game will contain spoilers and a lot of them. Please do not watch this video if you have not played the game. Or do, I don't really care. So, for a while now, I've really wanted to make this video. It's always been something that was on my mind. As you can tell by the title, this video is going to be about Uncharted Drake's Fortune, which was developed for the PS3 by Naughty Dog and released in 2007, exactly 10 years ago today. Or so I hope. Otherwise, this is all just a waste of time and effort, to be perfectly honest. So firstly, I wanted to start with saying that I played Drake's Fortune for the first time in 2012, after I had played Uncharted 3. So for me, it went Uncharted 3, Uncharted 1, Uncharted 2, Uncharted 4, as I am still yet to play Golden Abyss, which is an odd way to play the games. So while this game is 10 years old now, I only played it for the first time 5 years ago, which is still a very long time, but I didn't really grow up with this series. I played the first 3 games all in 2012 and then waited 5 years for Uncharted 4, which is the only Uncharted game I ever played on release day, before Lost Legacy came along, that is. For some reference, this means that when Drake's Fortune came out, I was only 7 years old and still living in Scotland. I am now 17 years old, which is also pretty crazy. As you can no doubt tell by me mentioning this game is very near and dear to my heart. It's always been one of my favorite games since I first played it 5 years ago. When I was first thinking of ideas on how to approach this video, the first one was to do more or less a comparison to the Lost Legacy, pretty much seeing how the game held up, for example. After time, I changed my mind and decided to do a retrospective critique of some kind, I'd guess you'd call it. That is the video that you will be watching today. Hopefully it's not too long or boring. I've never attempted one of these, but I've always wanted to, so I hope it's not really shit. Because of how much I love this game, it only seemed right to do as unbiased of a critique as possible. I don't want to be giving this game more credit than it deserves, because even coming from a fan of this game, Drake's Fortune is one of the most overrated games I think I've ever played. Overrated does not necessarily mean bad, but for the purposes of this video, I must be as unbiased and look at things as objectively as I can. I really hope that statement doesn't end up being contradictory, as I will still give my general opinions on pretty much everything. This is still me we're talking about. And we know how I am, what with my nose picking and all. Oh sorry, I meant
nitpicking.
I will be running through the whole story and, like I just said, giving my thoughts on just about everything. This video won't be focused on gameplay, so for the majority of this video we will just be talking about the story and the characters, as that is the main reason I have played and enjoyed this game and series so much. There are only a few moments when I mention gameplay, so if you want my thoughts on it, I'd say it's barely enjoyable and feels like filler in a game that is so concerned with its story. There were certainly better ways to have combined gameplay and story, and only one moment sticks out in my mind where they kind of do that. Unrelated, but for this video I actually had to re-buy Drake's Fortune on my PS4 for $18, as my Nathan Drake collection disc no longer works. $18 isn't a lot of money, but I think that shows that making this video was very important to me. I also put a ridiculous amount of effort into this, and even though it's not perfect, I'm mostly happy with the video. Although I will admit that writing this script was very difficult, and it's certainly the hardest one I've written to date. I was unsure of how often I should be talking about every single detail or a certain line of dialogue. Hopefully I did a good job of balancing it and it's not too boring or just drags for too long. If you want my personal thoughts on the video, I think it starts off really bad, it gets better when I start talking about chapter 4, and then kind of dies out after chapter 9, and it then picks up a little after chapter 13. I don't really know why. Maybe I just wrote too much at the same time and needed to take a break. I think that the video overall is probably not as good as my one on A New Frontier, but is much better than my Uncharted 4 video. Either way, enough rambling, I hope you enjoy the video. Please feel free to give any and all feedback you may have, as I want to improve at making these kinds of videos. It was a challenge to do and I procrastinated a lot, so I'm really glad I actually did it. Uncharted Drake's Fortune is a very easy game to understand. It's a third-person shooter with a lot of that puzzling, climbing, and all that other generic stuff you'd expect to find. And as for the story, Nathan Drake, a young treasure hunter, alongside Elena Fisher, a journalist, and Victor Sullivan, just a cool-ass guy, are in search of the El Dorado, an ancient golden statue. As well as searching for the treasure, Nathan is also trying to find out more about his ancestor, Sir Francis Drake. This is most of what you need to know. I apologize for that being a bit shit, but this brief synopsis is not really something that I was too concerned with. If you're watching this video, then I imagine you've already played the game, so I'd rather talk about what actually happens in the game, so moving on. So let's start from the beginning. The game opens with a quote from Sir Francis Drake himself, as do the other 3 games. Wait, actually, no they don't. Uncharted 2 had a quote from Marco Polo, 3 had one from T.E. Lawrence, and 4 had one from Henry Avery. What the fuck? I genuinely never realized that. Either way, this quote basically tells you that things do not always go the way you want, but sometimes it works out in the end. I'd say that quite obviously links to the ending of the game. From there, we see Francis Drake's coffin, and we then have a pretty good transition to Elena's camera, where we see Nate trying to open the coffin. Nate finds Francis Drake's journal inside of the coffin, which ends up being empty. He believes the journal will lead him to the treasure. Elena tries to see what's in the journal so she can film it for her show, which causes the two to have an argument about the journal and who gets to keep it.
Deal was for a coffin. That's it.
Wait a minute. If my show hadn't have funded this expedition, you wouldn't have...
You got your story, lady.
Look, Mr. Drake, you signed a contract. I have a right to see every single thing that's...
Could you hold that thought?
Which is interrupted by Nate spotting pirates in the distance. It's not clear how they got there, I imagine they just followed Nate somehow, but what is definitely clear is why they are there. Nate's casual reaction to this all tells the player that this is not a very serious story, in case you didn't know.
Do you know how to use one of these?
Yeah, it's like a camera. You point and shoot, right?
Good girl. Here we go.
After a few minutes of killing pirates, Sully, called earlier by Nate, comes to the rescue in a plane. Nate and Elena abandon ship, and the three of them then fly off. In the next scene, we can clearly see that Nate is very passionate about history, and Sir Francis Drake in particular, while also telling us that Sully doesn't care too much about that and is just in it for the money, but is willing to go along with it because of his relationship with Nate. As far as the first game in the series goes, this is most of the character development you get. There are some really great parts later, though we'll get to those. Sully also convinces Nate to leave Elena behind so that she won't slow them down. After this all takes place, Nate and Sully end up in some jungle where they walk for a little while. After a short, let's call it an altercation with a boulder, Nate and Sully realize that the Spanish were also looking for the treasure.
Check this out. Looks like the Spanish got here before he did. What the hell, Sully?
Nate, I'm not looking for a lousy piece of tin. I'm up to my eyeballs in debt. I was really counting on this one.
A little later, we find out that El Dorado isn't actually a city of gold, but a golden statue, which I kind of already spoiled. This is one of many twists or reveals in the game, and it came so incredibly early that you probably completely forgot about it, just like me. I don't mind this though, a golden statue is a lot more practical than a city of gold.
Of course. El Dorado, the Golden Man. Sully, it wasn't a city of gold. It was this. It was a golden idol.
Man, can you imagine what that thing would be worth now?
Look over here. Tracks. I bet the Spanish dragged it out on cut logs. We're 400 years late for this party.
Nate and Sully then decide to follow some tracks they believe to be from the Spanish moving the El Dorado statue, and then out of nowhere, there's a fucking U-boat in the middle of a fucking river. What the fuck? This chapter as a whole is pretty boring, but this one part makes it incredibly memorable. I mean, it's just so fucking stupid, but that kinda makes it brilliant. While inside the U-boat, Nate finds a map and realizes that it shows the island where El Dorado is believed to be. Once he gets out of the U-boat, we are introduced to the main villains, Roman and Navarro.
Friends of yours, Sully?
I'm Gabriel Roman.
Yeah, I know who you are, asshole.
I don't have a lot to say about these two, as there isn't a lot to say about them. They're both entertaining enough and serve their purpose to the story, but they're really nothing special and are probably the weakest villains in the series due to a lack of screen time. It's here where we learn that Sully owes Roman money, hence why he showed up. Due to Roman no longer believing he needs him, Roman then shoots Sully before the U-boat explodes from Nate accidentally messing with a torpedo earlier. From here, Nate runs away and Elena shows up somehow. I guess she followed them, without any way of knowing where they were going. This happens a stupid amount of time in the series, so sure, why not? Nate and Elena then make their way back through the ruins from before. Although Nate is clearly not too bothered, he recommends that Elena doesn't come with him, but she does anyway. While Nate and Elena are on their way to this new island, which looks exactly the same as the other island by the way, that always confused me, they're attacked mid-flight by, I think, Roman's men? I actually don't know. I suppose that would make the most sense at this point. Either way, both of them parachute out of the plane and are then separated shortly after. I want to stop right here to quickly talk about the pacing of the game, as most of what I'm about to say is linked to the previous chapters as well as chapter 4. Now obviously, my experience will differ from yours. You may think the game is well paced and flows nicely. In some way, I can agree. I think that Drake's Fortune works a lot better when you look at the whole thing rather than individual chapters or parts, if that makes sense. For me, I found the pacing mostly decent, but the issues I have with it are more to do with how nothing really happens. The game is paced nicely and you're constantly moving, which is something I like, but it's just so uneventful and kind of boring. The few times the game does throw something new at you, it's generally very gimmicky and underwhelming, like the jet ski sections. I don't have much to say about this, but I wanted to mention that. As well as that, story-wise, nothing happens in chapters 4 or 5. It's mostly just a lot of repetitive gunfights and bland environments, which is generally saved by the music. The music is incredible, just so you know. In fact, I'd say the best thing about Drake's Fortune is the music, but maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. One thing I will say about these chapters is that they're very atmospheric, same with the whole game. There's a very creepy vibe to this island, and the music complements that amazingly. As I said, not much happens here, so I'll just try and quickly scan over a few things. Nate finds part of the plane in a tree, and the map he was looking for is still there. Nate's reaction to finding the map is fantastic, by the way.
Sweet.
From here, Nate sees Elena's parachute and immediately assumes the worst. He continues on and makes his way to a big-ass wall. I really like this short part where the camera pans out to show you the fortress you're about to climb. By this point, we're on chapter 5. The reason I'm taking this break is because I want to make it clear that I think the game gets a lot better from this chapter, for reasons I'll get into. I'd also like to say that the first few chapters of the game are, to me, pretty terrible. I can find some enjoyment in them if I try hard enough, but I shouldn't have to do that. I'd also like to say that I imagine that section of the video was pretty boring, as there was a lot of me talking about things you may already know. I apologize for that, but I feel as if there's only so much I can do with those chapters. I hope the remainder of the video is more entertaining and that I actually start critiquing things. With that said, let's continue. Once again, Nate shoots his way through more goons. There's a particular gunfight in Chapter 5 which I actually think is pretty good though, as almost every time I play it, I have to adopt some kind of different strategy. I can't pinpoint why that is exactly, so maybe it's just me subconsciously trying to approach it differently. Or maybe that's fucking stupid. Up to you. A little later on, while trying to find Elena, Nate spots a tower which is also on the map. There's a very short and odd puzzle in order to get up to the tower. It's very elaborate and it's the type of thing that feels intentional and not very subtle, so it's not very good. Either way, Nate acquires a key and makes his way to the next area. In this courtyard, there are already enemies lying in wait. This is kind of ridiculous though, as you have to do this whole convoluted bullshit to get a key, but these guys can just show up. After shooting for even more goons, but that's getting a bit repetitive to hear, Nate comes across a marking on a wall, which he realizes is from Sir Francis Drake. Nate then realizes that Francis Drake actually did make it to the fortress and was making his way to the same place Nate is headed, in order to find Elena, I believe. This should have been a moment of, I want to say, clarity for Nate, as it would clear up any doubts he may have had about Francis Drake. Also where we can sympathize with him and feel that same joy, as we realize this whole adventure isn't a waste of time and that it's actually something worthwhile. But nope, here's a fat guy with a shotgun instead. This happens a lot and it's very frustrating. The game wants to tell you a story and give you a great scene, but then doesn't actually give itself time to do that. It feels like Naughty Dog were afraid to have the player be bored or not shooting something. Compare that to Naughty Dog nowadays, where they're basically screaming at you to appreciate their games. Either way, you carry on, kill some more goons, and come to that other tower I mentioned. You enter the tower and find a telescope that Nate assumes is Francis Drake's, a pretty safe assumption considering this is Drake's tower. He uses the telescope to find the customs house, which is where Nate and Elena need to go next. Speaking of Elena, he also finds her right on the edge of the fortress. Nate also spots two enemies and quickly takes out one of them, but the other one fires a grenade at you and you get killed. Oh sorry, I meant knocked out. It's only a grenade after all. It's here where the story starts to pick up more. The last two chapters have felt a lot like filler with the same old gunfights. It's also here, in this prison cell, where we meet the final villain, Eddie Raja.
Hey, Drake.
Eddie Raja. I should have guessed.
Fascinating document, huh? Seems like this Sir Francis was in my line of work.
Eddie Raja is something of a fan favorite, and while I've never really cared for him too much, he is a lot more entertaining than Roman and Navarro. I also think it helps the story by having an entertaining villain who not only has pretty understandable motivations, but also a villain that knows Nate and has history with him. This isn't the only time in the series this happens, obviously, but it was pretty well done, and to wrap up that incredibly long thought, I like Eddie Raja quite a bit. But much like Roman and Navarro, he suffers from not having a lot of screen time. After this short but entertaining scene with Eddie, Elena manages to break Nate out of this cell. This leads to pretty much the only set piece in Drake's fortune, as well as being the first of, I think, 4 convoy chases in the series, and it is the definition of on the rails. Not to say it's bad, in fact it's pretty good and holds up well. I really like how you can shoot the trees and have them fall over, something I never actually knew about. Unfortunately, this is a really weird missed opportunity, because every tree you shoot falls to the side that the enemies aren't on, so it doesn't actually affect the gameplay at all. It's just there to be there, which is stupid, because like I said, I only noticed it a little while ago. I suppose you could say this with Naughty Dog having a good attention to detail, so sure, why not? This chase continues for a few minutes, and like I said, it's pretty good stuff. Nate and Elena manage to make this jump onto the other side of the bridge, which leads to a dead end. When all of a sudden, Eddie, and not just Eddie, but a lot of his men and a truck show up out of nowhere. How in the fuck did they get there? I feel like a better way of doing this would have been for Eddie to just be an absolute badass and somehow jump onto their jeep. Okay, that's actually terrible, but I hope you see what I'm saying. These kinds of things just keep happening, and it's not so much a, it's not a serious story, don't worry about it thing. It's more a, that doesn't happen in real life sort of thing. It can be a bit distracting. Funnily enough, I'm able to buy into zombie-like creatures because it makes sense to the plot, but not to enemies spawning randomly. Anyways, Nate decides that the best idea is to reverse off this cliff and into the water. Sure, why not? There weren't exactly any other options. From here, Nate and Elena swim to the other side, and what do you know, Eddie's men are already there. I just can't even be fucking bothered anymore. I really wish that at least this chapter could have been free from more gunfights, but what can you do? After taking out these few enemies, Nate and Elena carry on, with Nate looking over Elena's footage and suggesting that they go for this boat. Elena wants to continue, however, so Nate admits that he wants to quit and give up because it's not worth dying over. This is one of the only moments in the game where I feel like Nate actually has some sort of internal conflict about things, I suppose. Obviously, he wants to continue and find the treasure, but, like he says, he doesn't want Elena's blood on his hands. It's nothing great, but it's at least something. This all causes Elena to make the point that they're going to have to go back through the harbor anyways, so they might as well do both and see how it goes.
Listen, either way, we have to head back to the harbor. Don't worry about it. We can argue about it later. It'll be great.
Wait. This time, I drive.
Okay.
It's a shame that the flooded city area is so nicely designed, and I'm actually a big fan of the environment, because the next part, and I am not exaggerating whatsoever, is the single worst part of any Uncharted game ever. The fucking jet ski. This part kind of makes me wonder why anyone actually likes this game. For starters, the controls are absolute wank. It feels so unresponsive and uncomfortable trying to control the jet ski. The physics are probably accurate, but I was so preoccupied with trying to get up these little fucking waterfalls that I just didn't care enough to notice. And most of all, it is not fun. Props for trying to add some variety into the game, but this just didn't work. It is objectively terrible. But to be fair, I still somewhat enjoyed these sections for the joy I get out of wondering where and how they managed to coordinate all of the red barrels. One of Eddie's men did a great job on that. Getting back on topic, after the jet ski area, we make it to the customs house. I enjoy the small part where Elena sort of foreshadows what will happen next, by mentioning a haunted Inca treasure. Naturally, Nate shrugs this off completely, because I guess that's his arc in this game. I just realized that I don't ever come back to this, so just to clarify, I mean that Nate's arc in this game is going from not believing in this curse, and then by the end of the game, he's seen it for himself, so that's his arc. I don't really have any opinion on it, but I don't think it's very good. Once at the customs house, Nate goes off by himself, kills more goons, and then comes back to Elena for yet another jet ski section. Oh, what fun. Once again, all that I said before is true here and more. The placement of the enemies is so bizarre, it feels like I'm in a video game and they just know where I'm going to be at all times. Luckily, this second jet ski section is a bit shorter, so that's something. Gotta look on the bright side. From here, it's the same old once again, with Nate fighting some more goons and then making his way up to this tower in order to zipline across and open the door into the customs house for Elena. Once we're there, we actually get a pretty great scene, where Nate and Elena start to warm to one another. We also get some context on why Nate carries around Francis Drake's ring. I'm not sure if it's mentioned before this, but either way, I'll give props for this scene. So Nate carries on while Elena gets more footage, and we end up in a massive room where it's pretty clear there's about to be a gunfight. Nate notices a helicopter fly over and remarks that it doesn't look like Eddie's. Obviously this is Roman, and for reasons we'll discuss later, I imagine this is him and Navarro coming to check up on Eddie and see what progress has been made. Either way, we have another pretty good gunfight that consists of this big room with a lot of cover. I don't know how well it will come across in the footage, as I have no real way of recording my PS4, but I generally tried to mix things up and move out of cover as often as I could. This gunfight has 2 waves and is maybe just a little too short, but otherwise, pretty good stuff. Once Nate has made his way through, Elena appears out of nowhere and shows him some footage of that helicopter we just saw, and it turns out Sully is still alive. This immediately makes Nate skeptical as to what is going on. By this point, there have already been a few hints that Sully could betray Nate, but Nate doesn't buy it and is now convinced they have to find Sully, since they already missed the boat. But it's all good because we have another jet ski section, and it's the longest of the bunch. That's 3 of them now, by the way. Once again, there is a whole lot of bullshit in this section, but there's also a lot of hilarious moments, like the fact that Elena's pistol mods itself and becomes an infinite ammo pistol that doesn't need to reload. That is amazing. After we get through that incredible action set piece, we come to a monastery. This place has a very creepy and unnatural atmosphere. Something weird feels like it's going on, as showcased by a short but effective scene where Nate and Elena find a booby trap that was put together with parts from their plane. We also get some hints, or rather full-on details, that there is some sort of monster on the island, the zombie-like creature I mentioned before. Skipping past a pretty lame gunfight outside of the library, once we get inside the library where Sully's being held, Nate and Elena confront him. Nate has a short argument with Sully, which doesn't really make sense. I'd imagine that Nate would know fully well that Sully is just going along with whatever Roman and Navarro have him doing, and that he wouldn't actually betray him.
Alright, stupid mistake. I didn't realize they'd try and track us.
Sully, we would have been headed home with the treasure by now if you had just for once kept your mouth shut.
And you might have thought of checking for a pulse before running off and leaving me for dead.
Nate and Sully quickly resolve their argument though, as Sully reveals Francis Drake's journal, which saved his life. Sully also finds out that something in this room will help them progress, which leads to an actual puzzle. But I don't know if I can even give props for this one, since it always confused the shit out of me. You're supposed to move these statues in a certain order and the journal tells you how to do it, but I always seem to move them in the wrong direction. I don't know if anyone else can relate to that, but it's an issue I've had with this puzzle for a long time. Once you solve this oddly complicated puzzle, we come to an underground section of the game. We walk around for a little while and Nate continues on before getting ambushed. In this underground section. How? As you've probably noticed, this kind of thing happens a lot. The game is so desperate to keep you on your toes and engaged, which I think is fine, but just randomly spawning in enemies for no reason as to how they got there is just annoying and lazy. And as you see just a few minutes later, Nate has to open this gate in order to get to where Roman's goons came from. So how did they even get down here? Did they purposefully lock themselves in there because they knew Nate was coming? And again, they just immediately act like they know you're there. They come out of nowhere and, straight away, they can tell you're there. And then when you eventually do get out of this underground part and into this church, the enemies in here are completely oblivious to the fact that there was gunfire just right below them. How does that sort of thing happen? Either way, we're now in this church. You take up more goons and then have to solve a stupidly easy puzzle that, even when I first played this at the age of 11, didn't give me any trouble whatsoever. You ring this massive bell and then shoot the other one on the other side. That's it. A door then opens and you make your way back underground before encountering Roman, Navarro, and Eddie in the room above. This is a short scene where Roman tells Eddie that they don't need his help anymore. As I mentioned earlier, around chapter 11, that helicopter was Roman coming to check how far Eddie has progressed with finding El Dorado. Unfortunately for Eddie, it doesn't end well and Roman basically fires him. I'm glad that Eddie was still alive, but I feel like Roman should have killed Eddie right here. This would have made him come across as a more threatening villain, and considering how little Eddie does in the rest of the game, this would have probably worked out well. Plus, Roman had no audience with him and didn't know Nate was there, so by him killing Eddie, we can clearly see that he doesn't crave attention from others, which could have made him a more sinister villain. I don't know, just an idea. The scene also tells us a little bit about Roman and Navarro's relationship, with an offhand comment about how Roman found Navarro in the slums of, I'd imagine, Spain or something. This is the bare minimum as far as villain development, but this scene manages to be entertaining due to the performances. As I mentioned before though, these villains are pretty underwhelming due to a lack of screen time, so whenever they are there, it feels somewhat forced. Like the game realizes they have to have the villains there right now, and you're just kind of like, oh yeah, these guys are still in the game, if you get what I mean.
Chasing this treasure of yours is proving to be more trouble than it's probably worth.
I assure you, El Dorado is worth more than you can possibly imagine.
It had better be.
From here, we continue on and end up outside of that same church from before. We climb our way up, take out 2 goons, and then there's a platforming section to get to this heart with 2 keyholes, window, door thing, open, words, I don't know. I like this part a lot actually. I really enjoyed how you explore the lower level of the church and then come back and you're now at the upper level. As always, the platforming is very easy, but I do generally die a few times in this section, mostly because of the controls. Once we get through this panel, figured out what it's called, we then find some more with different symbols before finding the heart with 2 keyholes again. Nate opens this panel and we see that same symbol on the roof of the building Roman and Navarro are in. So we just went from underneath that building to now being above it. I don't know why, but I kind of like that. Nate then calls Sully to let him and Elena know, while also telling them to come through the catacombs as he did. I also find this part quite funny, since it's just a random building that Sully told Roman and Navarro to go to, and it actually then ends up being where they need to go. But I also dislike it because it's incredibly convenient and just seems kinda lazy. Wouldn't be a video of mine without some nitpicking, would it? After shooting some more goons and another simple puzzle where you follow the instructions, we come to the treasure vault, which is probably my favorite chapter in the game. Not necessarily because it's the best chapter, but because it's the one that sticks out to me the most. I'm a big fan of the music and atmosphere in this first half. I really like the first half, the second half less so. I'll get to that. So Nate realizes that, on the map, there are the Roman numerals 2, 5, and 7, I believe. So as you'll notice on the ground, those symbols tell you where to go. I kind of like that. The game is still telling you what to do, but it isn't necessarily as straightforward as following instructions. I also really like the design of this level. It feels a lot bigger in scale than most of the sections in the game, and it matches the later games in that sense. One big reason I'm a fan of this chapter is because the game actually throws some challenging platforming at you in the form of these giant spike beacons. You have to actually time where you're going to jump and when, because if not, you get got. I like this part a whole lot, and I wish this kind of thing was in the game more. It's okay to challenge the player every now and then by adding some variety, so I'm a big fan of this. It's one of the only times in the game where they offer some variety and it actually works. More of this and less of the jet ski, please. Unfortunately, as the chapter continues and just gets creepier and creepier, Eddie fucking Raja comes out of nowhere. This game has a fetish for surprise entrances, I swear to God. Anyways, Eddie Raja is here. Yes, still looking for the treasure, I suppose. This part is just terrible. I was really enjoying the slower pace of the chapter until this point. I think this section of gunfights is incredibly unnecessary and actually ends up hurting the chapter more than helping it. I really wish the game had some restraint and just allowed you to go about your business with all that tension building up as things get creepier, but unfortunately, that doesn't happen. It is mostly redeemed though, because right after this, we have the single best scene in the game, and one of the best moments in the series, as Nate and Sully enter the actual treasure vault to find no treasure and a skeleton body instead. The body of Sir Francis Drake himself. We see how much this all means to Nate, and we naturally feel bad for him. Nate is incredibly saddened by this, so much so that he leaves Francis Drake's ring, as he remarks that it was all a waste of time. It's one of the only moments in the game where I felt like I was actually invested in the story. From this revelation, Nate now has a shift in perspective. He no longer cares about the treasure, or risking his life to find it, just to end up so close, like Sir Francis. He realizes that they must save Sully and get off this island. The music here is also fantastic. It's very thematic and fitting to this scene, which I guess it has to be since the song that plays is called Drake's Elegy. It tells you everything you need to know and makes things feel more impactful and emotional. This scene is really great, and I'm glad the game actually gave itself a chance to showcase some of the great acting and dialogue that Uncharted is known for. Like I said, this is easily the best part of the game to me. Fortunately, that actually continues, as we get another decent scene with Eddie Raja and just one of his men, as they seek shelter in the treasure vault. For Nate and the player, we have no idea why this is, other than a few hints from earlier that something non-human was in here. We see these zombie-like creatures come out of the holes in the ground and kill one of Eddie's men. Nate realizes they are in some bad shit, so he quickly tries to get Elena to loosen the pulley system where he gave her a boost, so they can get out. Nate and Eddie decide to work together, and I like this a lot. In fact, I wish Eddie had survived this part and continued on with Nate for at least a little while.
Drake, if we don't make it out of here, I just want you to know, I hate your guts.
Yeah, likewise, pal. Now let's do this.
Either way, this part of the game is also kind of good for gameplay, surprisingly. You're no longer restricted to cover. In fact, there is no cover, so you have to move around, which I'm perfectly fine with, considering how finicky and uncomfortable it is trying to get in and out of cover, and then accidentally rolling into a different piece of cover because the game always assumes that's what you want to do. Well, it's not always what I want to do, game. These zombie things are too fast for you to aim your weapon, so you have to blind fire them. I like this part, as it does mix things up. It definitely came as a surprise, and because it's that supernatural element thing that the first 3 games were influenced by, you probably either love it or hate it. I'm in the middle somewhere. But yes, as mentioned, Eddie Raja dies in a fairly pathetic way. Like I said, I would have preferred Eddie had continued on with Nate and Elena, maybe until the end of the game. Along the way, you would slowly build up your trust in Eddie. Maybe he could accompany you into the bunker area and save your life, making the player trust him through gameplay. Eventually, Eddie would come back and kill both Roman and Navarro as revenge for firing him, and then he becomes the main villain, abducting Elena in the process. Plus, that would make sense since Eddie made it clear that he wanted the girl as well as the treasure. Just an idea. After Eddie's underwhelming death, Nate and Elena escape from the creatures only to find that they are in a Nazi hideout of some kind. I suppose that explains the U-boat from chapter 3. Elena finds some documents which Nate takes a look at and realizes that it shows the location of the El Dorado and that the Germans moved the statue right underneath the church from chapter 14. So as you can tell, this game has a lot of backtracking. I'm not the biggest fan of this, but I don't really mind it in this game since, like the church, you're generally exploring a different side of that same area. So Nate decides to try and make it to the generator room so that they can power on an elevator to get out of this room. Nate wants Elena to come with him, but Elena convinces him to leave her as she can't make this jump or something like that. I don't really know. This part of the game tonally came out of nowhere. I think this is a good part in the game for sure, but it's definitely a bit random. But once again, this is one of the sections where the music just kind of carries everything else. I'm not saying the music is doing all the work, but it's probably the most consistent thing in this game. This also seems to be a part of the game that a lot of people dislike. Maybe it's just because the game isn't letting you just sit and cover for once, and you have to be somewhat strategic. Or maybe I'm just giving the game too much credit and it's because these things are scary. I don't know, I never really felt that, and that's coming from someone who actively avoids horror games. Either way, Nate makes his way to the generator room. Shortly after, he runs into more of these creatures. I don't mind that these creatures are still in this area hundreds of years after they were first there, but I also wouldn't have minded if they were absent. Again, it's much like chapter 16. I wouldn't have minded having a break from combat, and I think it would have really worked here. There'd be a constant sense of feeling like the creatures will attack, but then they don't until you least expect it, or maybe not at all. You run back out of the room and lock in the creatures that ambushed you in there. From there, we have another great scene in the projector room. It's revealed that the El Dorado isn't actually a statue at all, rather it's a sarcophagus that holds, I think, some kind of curse, which infects whoever is near it or breathes in the air. In this case, the Spaniards, which I never really knew for sure because I always thought it was the Germans. Either way, it turns them into these descendants, I believe they're called. This is another really great moment. It's one of the game's only twists that I actually liked. The fabled El Dorado treasure that you've been searching for isn't even a treasure, it's pretty much a coffin. Nate then finds a note from Sir Francis, which he reads out. I think it's best to just play this whole part out for you, as there really isn't anything I can add.
My end is near. The devils hunt for me in the darkness. The gold of El Dorado bears a terrible curse. The Spaniards have unleashed hell, become as demons. My men have all been murdered, leaving the task to me alone. No ship will depart this island. I destroyed them all and drowned the cursed city. A thing of such great evil must never leave these shores. In my final hour, I commend my soul to God. May he have mercy on this unholy place. Francis Drake.
This once again adds some more depth to the plot, and as you can probably tell by what I've said so far, much like in Uncharted 4, I was way more interested in the story of the treasure than I was the game's actual story. So I guess that's a backhanded compliment. Nate then tries to make his way back, and is in the room opposite where Elena is. Unfortunately, Roman and Navarro appear from out of nowhere. Now, I'm not saying they couldn't have shown up, but in what has to be less than 30 minutes, they managed to navigate all the way through the treasure vault, somehow get up to the top level, and then bust their way into this room. Also, why are they waiting here for Nate to tell him they have Elena? Why not just leave straight away and not waste time? Either way, Roman and Navarro leave with Elena, and they head to the church with the knowledge of where El Dorado now is. So Nate has to fight his way through some of Roman's men, who, as always in this game, appear out of thin air. I think this last section is okay, since you have to fight not just Roman's men, but also the Descendants. I think it's pretty impressive that they were doing this back in 2007, so it's not terrible. Nate then makes his way to the elevator, where obviously there's no elevator, as Roman and Navarro took it. But even still, where is the elevator after this? How did it just disappear? Once Nate climbs out the elevator shaft, he calls Sully to let him know what's happening. Sully's pinned down outside the church, so Nate goes to help him. This is a decent section of combat. It can be a bit frustrating with enemies coming from lots of different directions and you being pinned down in one spot, but I guess that's the point. Either way, Nate and Sully take out these enemies in this courtyard before continuing on into the church. Once again, there are more enemies. And again, this part is perfectly fine. I think it makes a lot more sense that Roman's men would be here defending the church so that Nate and Sully couldn't get through, so I don't mind this part. What I do mind is how when you finish taking out the enemies, you move this table and make your way down to the El Dorado. So after all this time, and being in this church more than once, it was just right there. That's kind of anticlimactic to me. But I can't really think of a better way to do this personally, so I guess it's fine. Once Nate and Sully make their way through some ruins, we finally see the El Dorado. This scene is pretty good, where we see Roman open the sarcophagus and he then starts to turn into one of the descendants. What brings this part down is that Navarro shoots Roman after he's opened the sarcophagus, meaning Navarro, a character who has done absolutely nothing in the game, is now our main villain. Not Eddie Raja, a much more entertaining character. No, we get Navarro instead, for reasons that are still unclear to me. He says that Roman's body is worth more than El Dorado for the right price, which just doesn't make any sense to me at all. It's clear that Navarro had some sort of issue with Roman, but I just can't understand his reasons for doing this. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of Roman becoming the main villain with no build-up or anything, really. Either way, whether you like it or not, Navarro then takes Elena as his own hostage and manages to escape. Nate then also escapes by jumping onto the El Dorado. Quick nitpick here, but I don't really understand how Navarro and Elena would have gotten into the helicopter. El Dorado is at pretty much the same height it is when Nate jumps, so how did they even get away? From here, Navarro makes his way to a boat. I like this part, since the game starts on a boat and also ends on a boat. I also love the way the sky looks, it makes everything feel dramatic and intense. This final battle is actually built up pretty well. Unfortunately, this boss battle is just straight up bad. It completely breaks the rules that the game has already established. In chapter 13, you're introduced to laser sights, so if you don't move around, the enemy will be able to kill you. During this boss battle, however, even if Navarro isn't aiming at you, you still die if you pop up when his laser sight is active. You could argue that Navarro is a better shot, and that he's using a shotgun, so he would have a better chance, but that clearly isn't the case, as I just mentioned. This could have been a more interesting fight by using the game's mechanics as a final test, but instead you just get shot out of nowhere and it's complete bullshit. After that disappointing boss battle, you take out Navarro with some good old quicktime events. Nate then goes to help Elena out of this helicopter which crashed earlier. Don't remember if I mentioned that. The helicopter is conveniently placed in a way so that what happens next is possible. Navarro, with the shotgun in hand, stands up and just stares at Nate as he pushes this fucking helicopter off the side of the boat. Navarro has his leg stuck in a rope and is pulled down by not just the weight of the helicopter, but also the El Dorado itself. So that means that the 500-pound El Dorado wasn't enough to make this helicopter fall off of the boat by itself, even though it was already on the edge. No, only once Nate pushes it off himself does anything actually happen. Again, maybe I'm just nitpicking, but that was really stupid to me. But it's all good, because we're at the end of the game. We get another good scene between Nate and Elena, where they both, more or less, reveal their feelings for one another. Elena then surprises Nate by giving him Sir Francis's ring back. You can't actually see her pick it up in chapter 17, but it's a nice moment nonetheless.
It's a shame we're leaving empty-handed, though.
Oh, well, you know, I did manage to save one small thing. Here, I thought you might miss this.
Thanks.
Yeah.
The two are then interrupted by Sully with a shitload of gold on this boat. From here, Nate's theme plays for, I think, the only time in one of the games when it isn't the credits. I really like how we see the fortress as well as the customs house as we're leaving the island. It makes the adventure a lot more impactful because it just kind of hits you that something so monumentally insane now appears so insignificant from this boat. Nate, Elena, and Sully then sail off towards the sunset as the credits roll. The ending is somewhat abrupt, but I think it's a very touching moment and is a good ending nonetheless. And that's Uncharted Drake's Fortune, a game that I've probably either made sound really good or really bad. You can decide for yourself, I suppose. Objectively, Drake's Fortune is easily the worst game in the series. It does a lot of things right, but more things wrong. The enemies appearing out of nowhere, the uneventful and at times repetitive environments, the gameplay in general is incredibly bare bones and mostly underwhelming, to name a few things, as well as being a pretty short game, as it only took me 3 hours and 42 minutes on normal difficulty to complete it. By the way, I'd certainly recommend you play this game on easy difficulty. You'll have a lot more fun and it will be a lot easier to experiment with different strategies. That said, I have played this game several times before, but if you're playing it for the first time, you're only looking at about 6 hours. The length of a game has never been a big deal to me. I enjoy Drake's Fortune, so I'm able to get past that, but it is worth mentioning. But what the game does do right, an interesting story with enjoyable characters and a very atmospheric soundtrack, is enough for me to enjoy this game. Maybe you won't though, and that's fine. A lot of people hate Uncharted, and I can see why that is, but it's always been one of my favorite game series. And Drake's Fortune, while a very overrated and flawed game, is certainly still one of my favorite games. And as much as I hate to leave on a sour note, I feel obligated to give this game a score out of 10. So I'll give it a 6 out of 10 when looking at the game objectively. I'd say that's still pretty generous considering how much I've criticized this game and also when you take into consideration how many other people have shat all over this game. As it stands, I don't have any real plans, but I imagine in a few years' time I will also do one of these for Uncharted 2 and free, but for now I haven't got many videos in mind. There's some games I want to talk about and make videos on, but I can't guarantee anything for a while. I feel as if I say that in every video I make, so I want to clarify and say that it's not because I'm off doing more important things, it's because making these videos is a lot of work and something that I find myself being addicted to. When I start making a video, I find it hard to stop until I've finished it, so basically I need a lot of consistent free time to be able to focus on writing a script, for example. It can also sometimes be hard to find the time and motivation to make a video like this when they don't get many views. But enough rambling, let's just end this thing already. So, there you have it. Those are pretty much all of my thoughts on the first entry into the Uncharted series. A lot of what I said is just my own opinion and you're allowed to disagree. I imagine a lot of people will. If I had to sum up Drake's Fortune in one sentence, I'd say that it was a decent start to an otherwise great series. I think that the games get a lot better from here, and I'm excited to probably one day talk about each of them. But to wrap things up, hopefully this video was worth all the time and effort I put into it, and most of all, I hope you enjoyed it. Also make sure to let me know of any feedback you may have, it's always greatly appreciated and helps me to make these videos better. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in a few months when I decide what video to make next.